My parents refused to pay for my surgery, saying it was too expensive, and left me in pain. Meanwhile, the following week, they bought my sister a shiny new BMW. I thought the injustice had ended there, but everything changed after my grandpa made a single phone call. Have you ever measured the precise, depreciating value of your own life against the sticker price of a luxury sedan and found yourself coming up short, not because you lacked human worth, but because the people who brought you into this world decided that white leather seats, a panoramic sunroof, and a twin-turbo engine were a better investment than your ability to walk without feeling like a jagged shard of glass was twisting in your spine? That specific suffocating realization is a flavor of betrayal that sits heavy in the stomach, a cold stone that never digests. And it was the sensation that defined the worst year of my life, a year where I learned that in the twisted economy of my family, love was not a birthright but a currency, and I was perpetually, hopelessly overdrawn. To truly understand the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of seeing my younger sister, Jessica, shriek with delight over a brand new, pearl white BMW M3 in our driveway, exactly 7 days after my parents told me that funding a spinal fusion surgery was simply not in the budget, you have to understand the dynamic that had been rotting our family tree from the inside out for 2 decades. I was the firstborn, the practice run, the child born when my parents were struggling, stressed, and climbing the corporate ladder, meaning my childhood was defined by latchkey afternoons, hand-me-down clothes, and the constant, grinding lecture that money was hard to come by and must be respected above all else. I was raised on a diet of, we can't afford that, and you need to earn it, lessons that I internalized until they became the foundation of my character. Jessica, born 6 years later when my father's firm had finally taken off and my mother had acculturated to the country club lifestyle, was the victory lap. She was the golden child born into an era of abundance, who was taught that the world existed to be consumed, that her desires were mandates, and that consequences were things that happened to other people. I watched her get the things I had begged for: the tutors, the camps, the car at 16 without asking, while I worked nights at a warehouse to pay for my own textbooks at the state college because my parents claimed that struggle builds character. I had always accepted this disparity as a quirk of timing, a bit of bad luck that I compensated for by working twice as hard, paying my own way, and never asking for help unless I was drowning. But then came the accident. It was a stupid, random event on a rainy Tuesday where a distracted driver ran a red light and T-boned my 10-year-old Honda, a car I was holding together with duct tape and prayer. The impact was violent, a chaotic blur of shattering glass and screeching metal that left me pinned in the wreckage for 40 minutes. But the real damage wasn't the totaled car, it was my spine. The crash crushed my L4 vertebrae and herniated the disc below it, discalgen, leaving me with a condition that the doctors called severe instability and that I called a living hell. The insurance payout from the other driver covered the emergency room and the initial rounds of physical therapy, but the policy was capped and the settlement ran dry long before my back was fixed. 6 months after the crash, my condition deteriorated rapidly. The temporary fixes failed. The numbness in my leg turned into a constant, burning fire, and I was left with a diagnosis that required a 2-level spinal fusion surgery, a procedure that cost $45,000 out of pocket because my entry-level job's insurance had a deductible and an exclusion list that made it practically useless for specialized neurosurgery. I was 24 years old, broke from existing medical bills, and living in a body that felt like a prison. I woke up every morning to a numbness in my left leg that the doctors warned was the prelude to permanent paralysis if we didn't intervene soon. I couldn't stand for more than 10 minutes without my vision blurring from pain. I lost my job at the warehouse because I couldn't lift boxes, and my office job was on the line because I couldn't sit in a chair for 8 hours. I delayed, asking my parents for weeks, driven by that ingrained pride and the fear of their judgment. I tried everything else first. I applied for medical loans and was rejected because my debt-to-income ratio was ruined by student loans. I tried to negotiate a payment plan with the hospital, but they demanded a down payment I didn't have. I even looked into selling my few possessions, but a used laptop and a guitar weren't going to cover a $45,000 surgery. So, with my pride swallowed and my back screaming with every step, I went to their house for Sunday dinner. It was a meticulously staged affair, as always, with my mother fretting over the roast and my father holding court about his stock portfolio, while Jessica sat at the table scrolling through Instagram, ignoring us all, occasionally complaining that the Wi-Fi was slow. I waited until dessert to bring it up, my hands shaking as I laid out the paperwork on the mahogany table, pushing aside the crystal water glasses to show them the MRI scans, the doctor's urgent recommendation letter, and the terrifying breakdown of the costs. I didn't ask for a gift. I didn't ask for a handout. I asked for a loan. I looked my father in the eye and offered to sign a legal contract to pay them back with interest over 10 years, to garnish my own future wages, to do whatever it took to just get the surgery so I could go back to work and reclaim my life. I watched my father put on his reading glasses, scanning the papers with the detached scrutiny of a loan officer denying a mortgage application from a stranger. He hummed and hawed, pointing out line items, asking if the anesthesia was really necessary, or if I could do it under local sedation to save money, a suggestion so absurd it made my stomach churn. After what felt like an eternity, he took off his glasses, glasses, folded them slowly, and delivered the verdict with a calm, rational demeanor that made the cruelty land harder than a shout. He told me that while he sympathized with my discomfort, a word he used to describe agony that kept me awake for 3 days straight, $45,000 was a significant amount of capital to liquidate. He explained, as if to a child, that the markets were volatile right now, that his assets were tied up in long-term bonds, and that they were currently house poor due to the extensive renovations they were doing on the summer cottage in the vineyard. He looked me in the eye and said that bailouts build bad character, that I needed to learn to navigate the healthcare system myself, and that perhaps I should look into medical tourism in Mexico or India if I really couldn't wait for domestic prices to drop. My mother chimed in then, not to defend me, but to support him. She added that surgery seemed so extreme and invasive, and asked if I had tried essential oils, acupuncture, or just thinking positively, implying with a sickening sweetness that my agony was a manifestation of my negative attitude, rather than crushed bone pressing on a nerve root. She said, "We just don't have that kind of liquidity right now, sweetheart. You know how tight things are with the remodel." I sat there, stunned into a silence that felt like drowning, listening to people with millions in assets and a vacation home tell me that my ability to walk wasn't worth the liquidity hit. The shame of that rejection was so hot and blinding that I simply gathered my papers, stood up with a wince of pain that I couldn't hide, and walked out without saying a word, leaving them to their coffee and their comfortable, insulated delusions. I spent the next week in a dark, terrifying depression, managing the pain with rationed opioids I hoarded like gold, sleeping on a heating pad on the floor of my apartment because the mattress was too soft. I spent the days staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was it, if I was just going to be disabled at 24 because I was too poor to be fixed. I convinced myself that maybe they were right. Maybe they really didn't have the liquid cash. Maybe I was being entitled to expect them to save me. I tried to rationalize their cruelty as financial prudence, telling myself that the summer house renovation was just bad timing, that they loved me, but their hands were tied. And then came the following Sunday. I hadn't planned to go over. The thought of seeing them made me nauseous. But my grandfather, my mother's father, was visiting from out of state. He was a quiet, stoic man who had lived a hard life, a man who had built a business from nothing and lost his wife young, and he rarely spoke, but he had always been the one person in the family who looked at me with recognition rather than judgment. I wanted to see him, to say hello, maybe just to sit in a room with someone who didn't view me as a disappointment. So I drove over, parking my beat-up rental car on the street because the driveway was full, forcing myself to limp the 100 yards to the house. When I walked up the path, I saw it before I saw them. It was impossible to miss. A giant red bow, the kind you see in Lexus commercials during the holidays and assume aren't real, was perched on top of a gleaming, pearl-white BMW M3 sedan, sitting in the center of the driveway like a monument to excess. The car was stunning, aggressive, and expensive, easily $80,000, nearly double what I had asked for to save my spine. The license plate frame was already customized. Jessica. The car was surrounded by my parents and my sister. Jessica was screaming with a pitch that shattered the quiet afternoon, jumping up and down, clapping her hands. I froze near the rose bushes, a phantom observer to a scene that felt like a hallucination. I watched my father dangle the keys, beaming with a pride he had never shown me, telling her that she deserved a safe, reliable vehicle for her unpaid internship at a fashion magazine, a commute of less than 5 miles that she could have easily done in her previous car, a perfectly good Audi. I heard him say, "We wanted to make sure you arrived in style, princess." I watched my mother hugging her, crying tears of joy, talking about how her baby was all grown up and how proud she was. The liquidity excuse evaporated like mist in the sun. The market volatility lie crumbled. The truth was naked and undeniable. They had the money. They had it in cash. They just didn't care enough about me to spend it. They would drop 80 grand on a toy for the daughter who had never worked a day in her life, but they wouldn't loan 45 grand to the son who was in danger of losing his ability to walk. I stood there, feeling a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the death of hope. It was the death of the son I had tried to be for them. I was about to turn around and leave, to vomit in the bushes and drive away forever, to cut them out of my life and figure out how to survive on my own, when the front door opened and my grandfather stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't looking at the car. He wasn't looking at the spectacle of wealth and indulgence unfolding in the driveway. He was looking directly at me. He was standing there in his old cardigan, leaning on the porch railing, his face a map of weathered lines and hard experience. He saw me standing by the bushes. He saw the cane I was using, the white-knuckled grip I had on the handle. He saw the way I was leaning against the fence to take the weight off my left leg. And most importantly, he saw the look on my face, the absolute devastation, as I watched my parents gift a luxury sports car to my sister while I was physically crumbling. He didn't say a word. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared at me for a long, intense moment, his eyes hard and unreadable, piercing through the distance between us. Then he turned his gaze to the car, watching Jessica pose for a selfie on the hood, watching my father laugh, watching my mother clap. He looked back at me one last time, a strange, resolute expression settling over his features. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out his old, battered flip phone. He flipped it open with a snap that I felt more than heard, and he began to dial. I watched my grandfather speak into the phone for less than 30 seconds, his face a mask of granite, before he snapped it shut and shoved it back into his pocket. He didn't look at me again. He simply walked down the porch steps, his cane hitting the pavement with a rhythmic, ominous clack that somehow cut through the noise of Jessica's shrieking delight. He moved with a slow, terrifying purpose, like a storm front rolling in over a calm sea. And as he approached the driveway, the atmosphere shifted. My mother was the first to notice him, her smile faltering as she saw the look in his eyes, a look she hadn't seen since she was a teenager, caught breaking curfew, but magnified by a lifetime of disappointment. She nudged my father, who was busy showing Jessica the twin-turbo engine, and the laughter died out, replaced by a confused, awkward silence. "Dad," my mother said, her voice pitching up into that nervous, placating tone she used when she sensed trouble. Look what we got for Jessica. Isn't it beautiful? We wanted her to be safe on the road." Grandpa didn't answer. He walked right past her, past my father, who was holding the spare key fob, and stopped directly in front of the gleaming white hood of the BMW. He looked at the car, then he looked at Jessica, who was sitting in the driver's seat gripping the leather steering wheel. "Get out of the car," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thin. Jessica blinked, her smile freezing. "What?" "Grandpa, look at the sunroof. I said, get out of the car," he repeated, this time louder, his voice cracking like a whip. Now, Jessica scrambled out, looking at my parents for help, but they were paralyzed. My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest in a vain attempt to assert authority. "Now hold on a minute, Arthur. You can't just order my daughter around. This is a celebration. We bought this car with our hard-earned money, and if we want to treat her, your hard-earned money?" Grandpa interrupted, turning to face my father with a look of such withering contempt that I actually saw my father take a step back. "You haven't earned a dime in 20 years, Richard. You manage the portfolio I built. You live in the house I paid for. You renovate summer cottages with the dividends from my life's work, and you do it under the condition that you steward this family with integrity." He pointed a shaking finger toward the rose bushes where I was standing, trying to make myself invisible. "I just watched my grandson, your son, limp up this driveway in agony. I watched him lean against a fence because he can't stand up straight. I know he came to you last week. I know he asked for help, and I know you told him you had no liquidity." My mother went pale. "Dad, you don't understand. It's complicated. Surgery is risky. We were just trying to—" "You told him you were house poor," Grandpa roared, his voice echoing off the suburban facades. "And then 7 days later, you drop $80,000 on a luxury toy for a child who has never worked a day in her life. You didn't have liquidity for his spine, but you had liquidity for her vanity? That isn't budgeting, Janet. That is cruelty, and I am done funding it." The silence that followed was absolute. My father tried to speak, to bluster, to explain, but Grandpa held up a hand. "I just got off the phone with the trust manager. I have invoked the morality clause. Your access to the family accounts is frozen, effective immediately. The allowance is terminated. The renovation funds are pulled. And this car?" He looked at the BMW with disgust. "It's going back to the dealership within the hour, or I will report it as purchased with embezzled funds." Jessica burst into tears, a high-pitched wail of entitlement, screaming that it wasn't fair, but no one looked at her. My parents were staring at Grandpa in horror, realizing that the faucet they had been drinking from for decades had just been turned off. My father started to plead, his voice trembling, talking about mortgages and bills, but Grandpa turned his back on them. He walked over to where I was standing, his expression softening as he looked at my cane and the pain etched into my face. "I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner," he said quietly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I thought they would do the right thing. I was wrong." He pulled his keys out of his pocket. "My truck is out back. Can you drive, or do you want me to?" "I can drive," I whispered, my voice thick with shock. "Good," he said. "Drive us to the hospital. I don't care what it costs. We're getting that surgery scheduled today. I'll pay for it myself." We left them there in the driveway, my sister crying on the hood of a car she would never drive, my parents arguing in hushed, panicked tones about how they were going to pay the electric bill, and we didn't look back. The surgery happened 3 days later. Grandpa stayed in the waiting room for the entire 6-hour procedure, and when I woke up in the recovery room, groggy and stiff but miraculously free of that sharp, shooting nerve pain, he was sitting in the chair next to the bed, reading a newspaper. He paid the $45,000 without blinking, and he paid for the rehab facility afterwards, moving me into his guest house so I wouldn't have to recover alone in my walk-up apartment. The fallout for my parents was swift and brutal. Without the buffer of the family trust, their lifestyle collapsed like a house of cards. It turned out they were leveraged to the hilt, living entirely on the monthly distributions Grandpa provided. They had to sell the house with the rose bushes within 6 months to cover their debts. The summer cottage was sold as is, mid-renovation, at a loss. They moved into a 2-bedroom condo across town, and my father had to go back to work at 55, taking a mid-level management job that he considered beneath him. Jessica had to drop out of her private university and transfer to the state school I had attended, a reality check that she blamed me for, claiming I had ruined her life by being a snitch. Though I had never said a word to Grandpa, I recovered. It took a year of physical therapy and grit, but I walked again. I ran again. I went back to work, finished my certifications, and started a career that was entirely my own. I see my parents occasionally at holidays, but the dynamic is broken beyond repair. They look at me with a mixture of resentment and fear, knowing that the balance of power has shifted permanently. They try to guilt-trip me, making comments about how hard their life is now, how small their condo is, but I just look at them and remember the BMW in the driveway. I remember the red bow, and I remember the pain. Grandpa passed away last winter, peacefully in his sleep. He left the bulk of the estate to charity, but he left me the truck and enough money to put a down payment on a modest house, one with no stairs, just in case. At the funeral, my parents cried loudly, performing their grief for the audience, talking about what a great man he was. But when the will was read and they realized they were getting nothing but a box of old photos, the mask slipped again. I didn't care. I drove home in his truck, feeling the ghost of his hand on my shoulder, knowing that he had given me something far more valuable than money. He gave me the truth, that I was worth saving. And as I parked in my own driveway, looking at a house that was paid for with work and love rather than entitlement, I realized that I was finally, truly walking tall.